Avoskister the silent worlds of the Aeldari Empire. There are places in the galaxy where even the stars seem to hold their breath. Worlds where the wind carries no sound, where ruins stand in configurations that defy the logic of physics and time, where the very air tastes of loss so profound it has become a tangible thing. These are the silent worlds, the scattered tombstones of the Aeldari Empire. And if you listen closely enough, in the spaces between your own heartbeat, you might hear what they have to say. What they whisper is not comfort. It is not hope. It is the story of a civilization that reached heights humanity can scarcely imagine, and then fell so catastrophically that reality itself still bears the scars. I first heard of the silent worlds not from an Eldar farseer or from ancient Xenos texts, but from a half-mad navigator who had seen one through the roiling madness of the warp. She described it between fits of weeping, her third eye weeping tears of blood, speaking of a planet that appeared on no charts, that existed in a pocket of space where the immaterium seemed to recoil in something that might have been reverence, or might have been horror. The buildings there, she said, were still standing, perfect, untouched by the 60 million years that had passed since the fall, but empty. So utterly, completely empty that the void itself seemed preferable. She took her own life 3 days after making planetfall back at Port Wrath. The last words in her log were simple. They are still screaming. They will always be screaming. The Aeldari Empire, at its zenith, was not merely a galactic power. It was the galactic power, a dominion that spanned the stars when humanity was still learning to chip flint, and the orcs were scattered warbands without the terrible unity they would later achieve. Picture it if your mind can bear the weight. Billions upon billions of worlds, each one a masterwork of psychic engineering and aesthetic perfection. The Aeldari did not conquer worlds. They sculpted them. They sang to planets until the stone itself rearranged according to principles of beauty that would drive a human artist mad to comprehend. Their cities were not built, but grown. Crystalline structures that pulsed with the collective psychic harmony of their inhabitants. Towers that reached toward the stars, not in defiance, but in conversation. As though the Aeldari and the cosmos itself were engaged in an eternal dialogue. The webway was their greatest achievement. A network of extra-dimensional tunnels that connected their empire in ways that made the concept of distance obsolete. While lesser species crawled through the materium or braved the sanity-shredding hell of warp travel, the Aeldari moved through their own private reality, insulated from the predations of the immaterium by psychic barriers that had stood for millions of years. Every world of consequence had its webway gate. And through these portals flowed not just travelers, but culture itself, art and philosophy and genetic refinement spreading across the galaxy at the speed of thought. They were gardeners of reality, and the galaxy was their canvas. The made-in worlds were perhaps their most profound expression of patience and vision. These were planets seeded with life and then left alone, tended by automated systems and occasional Aeldari shepherds, allowed to develop into paradises over the course of millennia. The Aeldari understood something that humanity, in its desperate scramble for every scrap of resources, has never grasped. That true wealth is measured not in what you take, but in what you allow to flourish. A maiden world might go untouched for 10,000 years, its ecosystem carefully guided toward a specific biological and aesthetic equilibrium, until the day when the Aeldari deemed it ready and claimed it as a jewel in their crown. They could afford such patience. They were, in their own estimation, immortal. Time was a resource they possessed in infinite supply. But immortality, as it turns out, is a poison that works slowly. when you have eternity stretched before you, when every desire can be fulfilled with a thought and the labor of psychically bound servants. When pain and hunger and fear are things you have engineered out of existence. What is left? What do you do with forever? The Aeldari had an answer, and it was the answer that damned them. They began to seek sensation for its own sake, to chase experiences that would make them feel something, anything, in the face of their perfect, sterile existence. Art became obsession. Pleasure became compulsion. Philosophy turned inward, becoming a labyrinth of self-indulgence and narcissism so profound that the Aeldari could no longer see anything beyond their own reflection. There were those who saw the danger. The Exodites, who fled to the farthest reaches of the galaxy and embraced a simpler existence on primitive worlds, abandoning the heights of Aeldari civilization to live in harmony with great reptilian beasts and the cycles of nature. They were mocked as backwards, as cowards who lacked the sophistication to appreciate the new cultural flowering. But they survived. The craft world Aeldari, who saw the gathering storm and built vast world ships to flee into the void, taking with them what they could of their culture and their sanity. They were dismissed as paranoid, as reactionaries who could not accept the evolution of their society. But they survived. Everyone else, the billions upon billions who remained in the core worlds of the Empire, who continued their spiral into depravity and excess, who pushed the boundaries of experience until those boundaries tore, did not. The fall came not as an invasion, but as a birth. The Aeldari had spent 10,000 years feeding something in the warp, pouring their psychic emissions into the immaterium with every act of excess, every sensation chased to its ultimate extreme, every boundary crossed in the name of feeling alive. The Chaos Gods are reflections of mortal emotion, and the Aeldari were the most powerful psychers in the galaxy. What they created was inevitable. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, the Dark Prince, she who thirsts. A newborn god that opened its eyes and screamed with a hunger that could never be satisfied, a thirst that could never be quenched. And in that first moment of awakening, it reached out and devoured the souls of every Aeldari in the core worlds. Imagine it. An entire civilization, billions of souls, snuffed out in a single psychic pulse. Not killed, consumed, drawn screaming into the warp to be tormented for eternity in the belly of a god they had created with their own corruption. The psychic scream was so profound that it tore reality itself, creating the Eye of Terror, a permanent wound in space where the immaterium bleeds through into the materium. Where once the heart of the Aeldari Empire had beat, now there was only madness and damnation. The webway, that perfect network that had connected their civilization, shattered. Most gates collapsed, trapping those inside in an eternity of darkness. Others became corrupted, portals that now led not to safe passage, but to the deepest hells of the warp. The silent worlds are what remains. Planets that once teemed with Aeldari life, now empty. Some were far enough from the core that the initial psychic shockwave killed their inhabitants instead of consuming their souls, leaving behind perfectly preserved cities full of corpses that have not decayed because even the bacteria could not survive the psychic aftershock. Others were in pocket dimensions or protected by ancient wards that shielded them from the worst of the fall. But when the survivors emerged, they found themselves alone, the webway connections severed, stranded on paradise worlds that had become prisons. Most of these died slowly, their populations too small to maintain genetic diversity, succumbing to despair and madness as the reality of their situation became clear. I have walked on a silent world. Once. Only once. And that was enough for a lifetime. The Inquisition expedition I was attached to had uncovered references to an Aeldari facility in the sealed archives of a conquered craft world. Coordinates that led to a planet in a region of space that ship charts labeled as empty. It was not empty. The planet was there, a jewel of blue and green, hanging in the void, orbited by 3 moons arranged in a pattern that no natural process could explain. Scan returns showed structures, vast complexes of what appeared to be wraithbone, the psycho-responsive crystal the Aeldari use for construction. The Inquisitor, a hard woman named Covenant, who had spent 80 years hunting Xenos artifacts, decided we would investigate. The moment our shuttle broke atmosphere, I knew something was wrong. The air tasted like copper and ozone, and there was a pressure behind my eyes that had nothing to do with the descent. Our pilot, a Navy veteran who had flown through Orc anti-air fire without flinching, was sweating, his hands trembling on the controls. We landed in what had clearly been a spaceport, vast landing pads of wraithbone that still bore the scorch marks of ancient shuttle exhausts. The buildings around us rose in elegant curves, each one a unique work of art, and every single one was empty. Not damaged, not destroyed. Empty. We found no bodies, no signs of struggle, just absence. Chambers that should have held living quarters were bare. The furniture present but arranged in ways that suggested the occupants had simply vanished mid-action. A table set for a meal that was never eaten, the food long since decayed to dust, but the dishes still in place. A workspace with tools laid out, an intricate device half assembled, waiting for hands that would never return to complete it. The silence was absolute. Our footsteps echoed in ways that seemed wrong, the sound dampened and distorted, as though the air itself was reluctant to carry vibrations. We found the central complex after 3 hours of searching, a massive structure that rose from the ground like a frozen wave, all flowing curves and impossible angles. Inside was a chamber that our Inquisitor identified as some kind of psychic amplifier. An array of wraithbone pillars arranged in a geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. At the center was a throne, and on that throne sat a body. It was mummified, preserved by the dry air and some quality of the wraithbone itself, dressed in robes that might once have been magnificent, but now hung in tatters. The face was stretched in an expression of such profound horror that 3 of our men refused to look at it directly. In its skeletal hands, it clutched a data crystal, the Aeldari equivalent of a servo skull memory core. Inquisitor Covenant took the crystal. Against every protocol, against the objections of the tech priest who warned that Xenos data systems could be corrupted or trapped, she activated it. The hololithic projection that sprang into being showed an Aeldari, alive and moving, speaking in that liquid musical tongue that sounds like water flowing over glass. The tech priest provided translation, his mechadendrites twitching as he processed the ancient dialect. What we heard was a message, recorded in the final days before the fall, by a seer who had seen what was coming and understood that there was no escape. The seer spoke of the long sleep, the period of cultural decadence that had consumed Aeldari society. They described how the seers and prophets had been warning of danger for centuries, how they had been dismissed as fearful conservatives who could not appreciate the new heights of experience their civilization was reaching. They spoke of their own failure, how they had tried to use their powers to see the future and found only darkness, an event horizon beyond which no vision could penetrate. And then they spoke of the last days, when sensitive psychers began to scream and claw at their own skulls, when the warp itself seemed to pulse with a terrible anticipation, when those with the sight began to see something forming in the immaterium, something vast and hungry that was taking shape from the psychic detritus of their civilization's sins. The seer had retreated to this facility, one of thousands of psychic research stations scattered across the empire, in the hope that the isolation and the wards built into the structure would provide protection. They gathered those who would listen, a handful of researchers and their families, and sealed themselves in. They felt it when the fall came, the psychic scream that echoed across the galaxy, and they felt their wards hold against the worst of it. But holding was not surviving. The station's population, cut off from the webway and the supplies it provided, numbered only 200. Too few to maintain a viable civilization. Too many to feed indefinitely on a facility designed for research, not long-term habitation. The seer described watching their people die slowly over the course of decades. Starvation, disease, despair. Some chose to end it quickly. Others clung to hope until hope itself became a cruelty. The seer had been the last, alone in this chamber, recording this message for whoever might find it. A testimony to a civilization that had reached for godhood and instead created only its own destruction. The message ended with a warning. The silent worlds were not safe. They were traps, psychic wounds that had never healed. Places where the barrier between reality and the warp was thin and getting thinner. Slaanesh, the seer said, was still hungry, still searching for the souls that had escaped during the fall. And the silent worlds called to the Dark Prince like beacons, unfinished meals that she who thirsts would eventually return to consume. Anyone who lingered on these worlds would feel that pull, that terrible attraction, the same corruption that had destroyed the Aeldari Empire, working its way into new victims. The last words of the recording were a plea. Leave this place. Let the dead rest. Do not become what we became. Inquisitor Covenant ignored the warning. She had spent her life hunting Xenos artifacts, and this facility was a treasure trove of Aeldari technology, psychic amplifiers, and data crystals and devices whose purpose we could only guess at. She ordered a full excavation, bringing down more personnel and equipment from the ship in orbit. I was assigned to the cataloging team, documenting everything we found for later study. It should have been the opportunity of a lifetime. Instead, it was 3 weeks of steadily mounting dread. The psychic pressure that I had felt upon landing grew worse day by day. I began to have dreams, vivid and terrible, of the Aeldari who had lived here. I saw them at the height of their power, beautiful beyond description, moving through their daily lives with a grace and confidence that made every human movement seem clumsy and crude by comparison. But I also saw what they became, the descent into excess and depravity, the way pleasure twisted into pain and art became obscenity. I saw their faces as the fall came, the moment of realization that they had damned themselves, the terrible understanding that what they had created was now coming to claim its due. And I saw what came after, the silence and the emptiness and the slow death of hope. Others on the expedition reported similar experiences. The Navy ratings who had been assigned guard duty refused to patrol alone, clustering together in groups and jumping at shadows. One of the tech priests suffered a catastrophic failure of their augmetics, their cybernetics seizing up for no reason that diagnostics could determine, leaving them paralyzed and screaming until they could be evacuated back to the ship. An astropath who had been brought along to monitor for psychic phenomena became catatonic after 3 days. Their mind apparently fled into some interior space where we could not follow. The Inquisitor insisted everything was under control, that these were simply the expected difficulties of operating in a Xenos environment. But her own behavior was changing. She spent longer and longer periods in the central chamber, studying the Wraithbone throne and the devices around it, speaking to herself in a language that none of us recognized. On the 20th day, one of the excavation team went missing. A junior researcher named Kale, assigned to document the residential sections of the facility. He simply failed to report for the evening muster, and search parties found no trace of him. His quarters were untouched. His equipment was still charging in the armory. He had vanished as completely as the Aeldari who had once lived here. The next morning, 2 more were gone. Then 4. The Inquisitor ordered a full lockdown, everyone confined to the central compound. But it made no difference. People were vanishing from locked rooms, from the middle of crowds, from positions where they were under direct observation. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, leaving behind not even a scream. I knew we had to leave. We all knew. But Inquisitor Covenant refused to abandon the site, convinced that we were on the verge of some great discovery that would justify the losses. She had found something in the data crystals, some reference to an artifact called the Mirror of Souls, a device that supposedly allowed the Aeldari to observe and commune with beings in the warp. She became obsessed with locating it, tearing through the facility's records with manic intensity, ordering excavations in sections that our initial surveys had deemed unsafe. I watched her deteriorate, her skin taking on a waxy pallor, her eyes gaining a fevered brightness that reminded me of addicts I had seen on 100 different worlds. On the 27th day, the remaining personnel mutinied. We had lost 38 people to the vanishings, more than half our ground team, and the Navy squad that had been assigned to security decided enough was enough. They seized the shuttles and prepared for an emergency evacuation. I was with that group, gathering my notes and samples, when the screaming started. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a psychic howl that bypassed our ears and resonated directly in our minds. I saw things in that scream, images that I still cannot fully articulate. Visions of the fall playing out in real time, the birth of Slaanesh rendered in colors and sensations that no human language has words for. And I saw the people who had vanished. They were not dead. They were somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the overlap between the materium and the warp, trapped in a moment of eternal horror, fuel for something vast and hungry that had noticed our presence and decided we were a worthy snack. We ran. I am not proud of that. But there was no alternative. The shuttles launched with only 23 of us aboard, less than a quarter of the expedition. Inquisitor Covenant was not among us. She had barricaded herself in the central chamber, still searching for her Mirror of Souls, and nothing we said or did could convince her to leave. As we broke atmosphere, our sensors registered a massive energy spike from the facility, a surge of psychic power that shouldn't have been possible from dead technology. Then the signals went dark, and the silent world below returned to its patient waiting. The Navy declared the planet off-limits, seeding it with warning beacons and adding it to the restricted navigation charts. But I know those measures are inadequate. The silent worlds do not need visitors to be dangerous. They are wounds in reality, places where the fall is still happening, echoes of that terrible moment playing out in slow motion across eternity. And there are thousands of them scattered across the galaxy, each one a trap waiting to spring, each one calling out to Slaanesh with a psychic resonance that grows stronger as the millennia pass. The Aeldari who survived the fall, the craft world dwellers and the Exodites and the twisted Drukhari who embraced damnation and made it their home. They know about the silent worlds. They warn their own away from these places, consider them cursed and forbidden. But they also cannot let them go, because these worlds represent everything they have lost, the full scope of their civilization's glory and the terrible price of their pride. Sometimes farseers attempt to reclaim silent worlds, to recover artifacts or data that might help their dying species. And sometimes they even succeed. More often, they simply add their own souls to the tally of the damned. Humanity, in its ignorance, stumbles onto these worlds with increasing frequency. The Imperium's expansion pushes into regions that were once Aeldari space, and survey teams encounter structures and ruins that no human hand built. Most of the time, they are wise enough to leave such things alone, to mark the coordinates and move on. But there are always those who are curious, who see opportunity rather than danger, who believe that they can succeed where others have failed. Rogue traders seeking ancient technology to trade, radical inquisitors pursuing forbidden knowledge, chaos cults drawn by the psychic resonance like moths to a flame. All of them find the same thing in the end: silence and emptiness, and a hunger that wears the face of their own desires. The question that haunts me, that has haunted me every day since we fled that cursed world, is whether the silent worlds are truly empty. The Aeldari seer who left that final message spoke of souls consumed, of an entire civilization drawn screaming into the warp. But what if that is not entirely accurate? What if some fragment remains, some echo of consciousness that persists in these places, not alive, but not quite dead, caught in the moment of the fall like insects in amber? Our instruments detected no life signs, but psychic phenomena do not always register on material sensors. The vanishings, the dreams, the way the facility seemed to react to our presence, all of it suggested something more than just residual haunting. Something that was aware. Something that was waiting. The Eldar have a concept they call the Infinity Circuit, a psychic construct within their craft worlds where the souls of the dead are preserved, safe from she who thirsts. It is their afterlife and their salvation, a way to cheat the damnation that awaits every Aeldari who dies without protection. But the silent worlds predate the craft worlds by millions of years. If the ancient Aeldari had their own methods of soul preservation, their own systems for maintaining consciousness beyond death, what happened to those systems when the fall came? Were they destroyed, their contents consumed by Slaanesh? Or did they survive, isolated and cut off, their inhabitants trapped in a kind of psychic limbo for 60 million years? I have researched what records exist, pulling every scrap of information I could find from inquisitorial archives and Navy survey reports. The silent worlds appear across the galaxy in no discernible pattern, as though the Aeldari Empire had no clear borders but simply existed wherever they wished to be. Some are garden worlds, lush and beautiful despite their abandonment. Others are artificial structures, space stations and orbital habitats that still maintain position and power after eons of neglect. A few are geological impossibilities, planets where the laws of physics seem negotiable, places where water flows upward and the horizon curves in directions that make no sense. Each one is unique. Each one is dangerous. And each one holds secrets that might explain what the Aeldari were before the fall, the heights they reached and the depths to which they fell. There are scholars who argue that understanding the Aeldari's failure is essential to preventing humanity from repeating it. The Imperium, they point out, is itself a declining civilization, clinging to past glories and sinking slowly into ritualism and decay. The technology that once came easily is now barely understood. The innovations of the dark age of technology lost and forgotten. Psychers are increasing in number and power among the human population, just as they did among the Aeldari in the ages before the fall. The comparison is uncomfortable, even heretical, but it exists. If we could understand what precisely went wrong with the Aeldari, what tipping point they crossed that made their damnation inevitable, we might be able to recognize and avoid that same precipice. But the silent worlds guard their secrets jealously. Every expedition that attempts to study them ends in disaster. The Ordo Xenos has lost more personnel to these places than to any other single category of threat, and that includes active war zones against Craftworld raiders and confrontations with the Drukhari. There is something about these worlds that defeats standard investigative procedures, that turns human curiosity into a weapon against itself. We see ruins and think of treasure. We find technology and think of advantage. We encounter the echoes of the fall and think we can study them safely, can understand and contain them. We are wrong every time. I think of Inquisitor Covenant, still searching for her mirror of souls in the darkness of that facility. And I wonder what she found. Did the artifact exist? Did she locate it? And if she did, what did she see when she looked into it? A mirror is a reflection, and the Aeldari at the height of their power would have built such a thing to show truth, not illusion. What truth would it show to a human who had spent her life fighting Xenos' corruption, who had seen the worst that the galaxy had to offer and believed she was hardened against it? Would it show her the birth of Slaanesh, the moment when a civilization's sins coalesced into a god? Would it show her own future, the damnation that awaits those who delve too deeply into forbidden knowledge? Or would it show her what she wanted to see? The promise of power and understanding, the lie that destroyed the Aeldari dressed up in new clothing to destroy humanity as well? The silent worlds are not relics. They are warnings. Every empty city, every abandoned research station, every pristine maiden world where nothing grows but where every blade of grass seems positioned with deliberate artistry, they are all shouting the same message across the void. This is what pride brings. This is the price of perfection. This is what happens when a species reaches too far and refuses to admit the cost. The Aeldari were masters of the galaxy, shapers of reality, artists and poets and warriors without peer. And they are dust now, their souls screaming in the belly of a god they created, their empire reduced to scattered survivors clinging to the wreckage of what they once were. If they could fall so far, what hope does humanity have? But perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps the better question is not whether we will avoid the Aeldari's fate, but whether we can learn from it. The Imperium is not the Aeldari Empire. Humanity's sins are different, our strengths and weaknesses following different patterns. Where the Aeldari fell to excess and pride, humanity's doom, if it comes, will likely stem from ignorance and desperation, from the constant pressure of survival in a hostile galaxy that leaves no room for growth or change. We have our own path to damnation, and it does not require us to repeat the Aeldari's mistakes. We are quite capable of making entirely original ones. Still, the silent worlds call to me. Even now, years after the expedition, safe in my office on a civilized world far from that cursed place, I sometimes dream of wraithbone towers and empty plazas. I dream of walking through streets where every building is a work of art, where the very stones sing with psychic resonance, where the air is thick with the ghosts of what was. In those dreams, I am searching for something, though I could not say what. An answer, perhaps. An explanation that would make sense of the senseless, that would provide meaning to the suffering I witnessed. Or maybe I am searching for the mirror of souls, that artifact that Covenant died trying to find, believing on some level that if I could just see what she saw, understand what she learned, I could make peace with the horror of it all. The Aeldari mythology speaks of a cycle, death, and rebirth, the phoenix that burns and rises from its own ashes. They believe, some of them, that their species will one day be reborn, that from the wreckage of their empire will come a new beginning. The Inari, the faction that follows the nascent god of death, they actively work toward this resurrection, believing that if they can gather enough souls, achieve enough power, they can overthrow Slaanesh and free their species from damnation. It is a beautiful myth. I hope for their sake it is more than that. But I have walked on a silent world, and I have felt the weight of 60 million years of silence. And I cannot shake the feeling that some falls are too far to recover from, that some sins cannot be forgiven, that some silences will never be broken. The galaxy is full of ruins. Humanity builds its cities on the bones of extinct civilizations, plants its flags on worlds where empires rose and fell before Terra's sun had finished forming. We are, in many ways, scavengers picking through the wreckage of those who came before, taking what we can use and discarding what we cannot understand. The silent worlds are different. They are not ruins in the traditional sense, places decayed by time and neglect. They are preserved, kept in stasis by forces that neither Imperial science nor Mechanicus lore can explain, frozen at the moment of the fall like specimens in a gallery. And they are waiting. For what I cannot say. For someone to learn their lesson. For the cycle to turn again. For the hunger that consumed them to find new prey. The silent worlds are patient. They have all the time in the universe. And time, as the Aeldari learned too late, is not always your friend. I keep a small piece of wraithbone on my desk, a fragment I recovered from that expedition before everything went wrong. It is a beautiful thing, translucent and faintly luminous, carved with patterns that shift and change depending on the angle of observation. By all rights, it should have been turned over to the Ordo Xenos for study, logged and cataloged and locked away in some archive where its secrets could be analyzed. But I kept it, a reminder, a warning. Sometimes, when the light catches it just right, I see faces in the crystal. Aeldari faces, beautiful and terrible, frozen in expressions that might be ecstasy or agony or both. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and my mind is tired, I swear I can hear them screaming. Not with sound, but with something deeper. A psychic resonance that bypasses my ears and speaks directly to whatever it is that makes me human. They are calling from the other side of the fall, from the moment of their damnation, and their message is simple. Remember us. Remember what we were. Remember that we were great, and that our greatness was not enough. Remember and do not follow. The silent worlds will outlast us all. Long after humanity has either transcended to something greater or succumbed to the same fate that claimed the Aeldari. Long after the Imperium has crumbled and the Emperor's light has finally gone out. Those empty cities will still stand. Those pristine maiden worlds will still orbit their stars. Those sealed facilities will still hum with ancient power. They are monuments not to achievement, but to hubris, to the terrible truth that all civilizations carry the seeds of their own destruction, and that the height from which you fall determines only how thoroughly you are broken. The Aeldari fell from a very great height indeed, and the sound they made when they struck bottom echoed across the galaxy, a psychic scream that tore reality and created a permanent wound in the fabric of existence. That scream never really stopped. It continues still, propagating outward through the warp and the materium alike. A warning that no one heeds because the truth it speaks is too terrible to acknowledge. We are all falling. Every species, every civilization, every empire that rises in the galactic night is simply marking time until gravity reasserts itself and we plunge into the same dark that claimed those who came before. The Aeldari's mistake was believing they were exempt from this universal law, that their power and sophistication could insulate them from consequence. They were wrong. And we will be wrong too in our turn when we make the same assumption. But until that day comes, we walk among their ruins. We pick through their abandoned cities and we marvel at their architecture. We study their technology and we convince ourselves that we can use it safely, that we are smarter or stronger or more disciplined than they were. We tell ourselves that we have learned from their example, that humanity will not repeat the Aeldari's errors. And maybe we are right. Maybe our fall will look different, come from different causes, leave different scars on the galaxy. Or maybe, when the end finally comes for our species, when humanity's sins finally coalesce into something that devours us as thoroughly as Slaanesh devoured the Aeldari, maybe the only difference will be that we had their example to ignore. Maybe we will have the distinction of falling with our eyes wide open, fully aware of the precipice, and stepping off anyway, because we could not imagine another path. The silent worlds know. They have seen it all before. They watched the Aeldari Empire reach its zenith and then burn. They felt the psychic shockwave of the fall and survived when billions did not. They have kept their vigil through ages beyond counting, empty and patient, waiting for the next civilization to rise high enough to be worth toppling. And when we are gone, when humanity is nothing but a footnote in some future species' historical archives, the silent worlds will remain. Silent, empty, beautiful and terrible and absolutely damned. Perfect monuments to the galaxy's oldest and grandest truth. That nothing lasts forever, that all glory is temporary, and that the silence that follows a civilization's end is far more profound than any sound it made during life. I wonder sometimes what an Aeldari would think if they could see me now. A human scholar obsessed with their fallen empire, dedicating my life to understanding their mistakes. Would they find it tragic that lesser beings now pick through their remains like carrion birds? Would they feel vindicated, knowing that their legacy had outlasted their civilization? Or would they simply feel nothing, their capacity for emotion long since burned away in the fires of the fall? The craft world Eldar, or I have spoken with, in the few carefully controlled circumstances where such dialogue was possible, they carry their species' history like a weight that can never be set down. Every one of them knows what was lost. Every one of them feels the absence of what should have been, the ghost of an empire that was murdered by its own hand. And every one of them looks at humanity with something that might be pity or might be contempt, seeing in us the same patterns that destroyed their own civilization, watching us walk the same path with the grim certainty that we will reach the same destination. Maybe they are right. Probably they are right. But I prefer to believe that the story is not yet written, that the silent worlds are a warning we can still heed, that the fall of the Aeldari Empire teaches us something more than the inevitability of doom. I prefer to believe that consciousness has value, that the struggle to understand and grow and become better than we were has meaning, even if the ultimate end is darkness. The Aeldari reached heights humanity has not yet dreamed of, and they fell from those heights into a hell of their own making. But they were still magnificent. Their empire was still a wonder. And the silent worlds, for all their horror, for all the warning they represent, are still beautiful. That is what haunts me most. Not the empty cities or the psychic weight of accumulated suffering. Not the vanishings or the dreams or the way Wraithbone seems to pulse with a life that cannot quite be called alive. What haunts me is the beauty. Every silent world I have studied, every record I have reviewed, they all speak of a civilization that understood aesthetics in a way humanity never has. The Aeldari did not build ugly things. They could not. It was not in their nature. Even their weapons, even their tools of war and conquest, were works of art. They shaped reality according to principles of beauty and harmony, and the worlds they left behind reflect that sensibility. Walking through an Aeldari ruin is like walking through a fever dream of perfection. Every line and curve optimized not for efficiency, but for aesthetic impact. Every space arranged not for function, but for emotional resonance. It is overwhelming. It is seductive. And it is a trap. Because the same drive for perfection that created such wonders was also what destroyed them. That is the final lesson of the silent worlds. The truth that I have come to understand through years of study and nightmare-haunted nights. Beauty is not enough. Art is not enough. Power and sophistication and the ability to reshape reality according to your whims, none of it is enough if you lose sight of why you are doing it. If the pursuit of experience becomes more important than the experience itself. If you sacrifice meaning on the altar of sensation. The Aeldari forgot this. They became so focused on feeling that they stopped thinking about what they were feeling or why. They chased novelty and intensity until there was nothing left to chase, until they had exhausted every permutation of experience and began inventing new ones, darker ones, taboos violated not because it brought joy, but simply because they were taboos. And in that final spiral, in that last desperate attempt to feel something, anything, they fed a monster in the warp until it became strong enough to devour them. Humanity is not there yet. We still have meaning, or at least we think we do. The Emperor, the Imperium, the struggle for survival against a hostile galaxy, these things give us purpose beyond mere sensation. But I see the cracks forming. I see the same patterns emerging. The noble houses of Terra, grown decadent on the spoils of conquest. The ecclesiarchy, more concerned with ritual and power than with the faith it supposedly serves. The Haras, guard commanders who send millions to die for inches of worthless ground because the strategic calculus says it is necessary. The slow erosion of humanity. The gradual transition from beings who strive to beings who simply endure. We are not falling as the Aeldari fell. Not yet. But we are walking toward an edge, and the silent worlds stand as markers showing us where that edge is located. Whether we turn back or step off remains to be seen. I will not live to see that answer. My time is too short, my life too brief a flicker against the immensity of galactic history. But I will spend what years I have studying the silent worlds, documenting their secrets, trying to extract meaning from the silence. It is perhaps a futile task. The Aeldari had millions of years to consider their civilization, and they still could not save it. What hope does a human, with decades at best, have of understanding what they could not? But futility has never been a sufficient reason to stop trying. If it were, the Imperium would have collapsed 10,000 years ago under the weight of its own impossibility. We persist because we must. We study because we must. And we hope, against all evidence and logic, that somewhere in the accumulated wisdom of failed civilizations, there is a lesson that will allow us to succeed where they failed. The silent worlds say no. They say we are all doomed, that the cycle of rise and fall is inescapable, that every empire contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that those seeds will inevitably germinate. They say this not with words, but with their presence, with the terrible weight of emptiness that hangs over them, with the beauty that has become horror through the simple act of persisting beyond its creators. They are a message written in absence, a warning encoded in silence, and their meaning is crystal clear to anyone willing to hear it. Greatness is not immortality. Achievement is not safety, and the brightest stars burn out the fastest, leaving behind only the dark. I carry that message with me every day. I see it in the wraithbone fragment on my desk. I feel it in the dreams that come when I close my eyes. I hear it in the spaces between sounds, the psychic whisper that says the fall never really ended, that it continues still, propagating outward through time and space until it has touched every corner of the galaxy. The Aeldari may have been the first to fall, but they will not be the last. The silent worlds guarantee it. They stand as proof that no one escapes gravity forever, that what goes up must come down, and that the silence that follows a civilization's scream is the only truly eternal thing in a universe that worships change. And yet, in my darkest moments, when the weight of that knowledge threatens to crush me, I remember something else. The Aeldari survived. Not all of them, not most of them, but some. The craft worlds sail the stars, keeping their culture alive against impossible odds. The Exodites maintain their simple existence on their dinosaur-riding paradise worlds. Even the Drukhari, twisted and damned though they are, prove that adaptation is possible, that a species can change to meet the requirements of survival, no matter how terrible those changes might be. The Aeldari as they were are gone forever, but the Aeldari as they are remain. Different, diminished, but alive. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps survival, not glory, is the true measure of success. Perhaps the lesson of the silent worlds is not that we should avoid greatness for fear of falling, but that we should be prepared to change when the fall comes, to adapt and persist and accept that the form we take tomorrow may bear little resemblance to what we are today. The Imperium could learn from that. Humanity could learn from that. We cling so desperately to the past, to the memory of the Emperor and the Great Crusade, to the technologies and systems that worked 10,000 years ago, but which are failing now. We refuse to change because we are terrified that change means death, that if we become something other than what we are, we will have lost the war regardless of whether we survive. But the silent worlds teach a different lesson. They teach that rigidity is death, that the refusal to adapt in the face of changed circumstances is what transforms civilizations into monuments. The Aeldari who fled to the craft world survived because they were willing to abandon their empire and everything it represented. Those who stayed, who clung to the old ways and the old glories, became the silent worlds. So maybe there is hope after all. Not the false hope of avoiding calamity, but the harder, more honest hope of surviving it. When humanity's fall comes, and it will come because all empires fall, perhaps we can be ready for it. Perhaps we can change what we must while keeping what we can. Perhaps we can learn the lesson that the silent worlds teach and become something new, something that can thrive in the galaxy as it is rather than the galaxy as it was. It is a thin hope, a desperate hope, but it is what I cling to when the dreams become too dark and the silence too loud. The silent worlds will still be there, long after that transformation has run its course. They are patient. They do not judge. They simply exist, beautiful and terrible and empty, a reminder of what was and a warning of what might be. And they will continue to call to those who have ears to hear, drawing the curious and the ambitious and the desperate into their embrace, adding new souls to the tally of the damned with every expedition that fails to heed their warning. The silence is not empty. It is full of screaming, full of the echoes of the fall, full of 60 million years of accumulated horror. But it is also full of truth. And truth, no matter how terrible, is worth preserving. The silent worlds preserve it. They are monuments to truth, and they will stand until the heat death of the universe. Or until someone finally learns what they have to teach. Whichever comes first.